At length he quieted down and seemed much more trackable, and then he and Edwin had some private conversation together. At the end of it he told Edwin that he would think about it, and that he could call again if he wished and bring his friends with him. Upon this he arose from his chair, escorted us to the door and showed us out, and I observed that he was almost becoming affable, though not quite. It was as if he was reluctant to submit to being pleasant. He stood at his front door watching us as we walked away, until we must have been nearly out of sight. Edwin seemed very pleased with our visit, and then he gave us some particulars of the strange man. He had, he said, been in spirit some years now, but in his life he had been a successful businessman. Successful, that is, as far as the earth plane judges such things. He had not thought of much else than his business, and he always considered that any means were justified in gaining his own ends, provided they were legal. He was ruthless in his dealings with all others, and he elevated efficiency to the level of a god. In his homes, all things and people were subservient to him. He gave generously to charity where there was likely to accrue the greatest advantage and credit. He supported his own religion and church with vigor, regularity, and fervor. He felt that he was an ornament to the church, and he was much esteemed by all those connected with it. He added some new portions to the edifice at his own expense, and a chapel was named after him as the donor. But from what Edwin had been able to glean from his story, he had scarcely committed one decent, unselfish action in the whole of his life. His motive was always self-aggrandizement, and he had achieved his purpose on earth at the absolute expense of his life in the spirit world. And now his grievance was that after having lived such an exemplary life in his own estimation, he should be condemned to live in such comparative squalor. He refused to see that he had condemned himself to it, and that there was none other to blame but himself. He complained that the church had misled him all along, since his munificence had been received in such fashion that he believed his gifts to the church would weigh heavily in his favor in the hereafter. Again, he could not see that it is motive that counts, and that a happy state in the spirit world cannot be bought for hard cash. A small service willingly and generously performed for a fellow mortal builds a greater edifice in spirit to the glory of God than do large sums of money expended upon ecclesiastical bricks and mortar erected to the glory of man, with full emphasis upon the donor. This man's present mood was anger, which was all the greater because he had never been denied anything whilst upon the earth. He had never been accustomed to such degrading circumstances as those at present. His difficulties were increased by the fact that he did not know quite whom to blame. Expecting a high reward, he had been cast into the depths. He had made no real friends. There seemed to be no one of his own social position, he said, who could advise him in the matter. Edwin had tried to reason with him, but he was in an unreasoning frame of mind, and had been so for some long time. He had had few visitors because he repelled them, and although Edwin had made many visits to him, the result was always the same: a stolid adherence to his sense of injustice. Upon Edwin's latest call, in company with Ruth and myself, and with the friend whom we had met on the way, there were distinct symptoms of a coming change. They were not manifest at first, but as our visit drew to a close, he had shown signs of relenting from his stubborn attitude, and Edwin was sure that it was due as much to Ruth's softening presence as to his own powers of reasoning with him. He felt sure, too, that were we to return to him on our way back, we should find him in a different frame of mind altogether. He would be unwilling to admit too soon that the fault was his entirely, but perseverance will work wonders. Ruth was naturally pleased that she had been able to be of service so quickly, though she disavowed any claim to have done anything but merely stand there as an observer. Edwin, however, at once pointed out to her that while she disclaimed any action and in an external order, she had shown a real sympathy and sorrow for this unhappy man. That explained his frequent glances at her. He had felt that commiseration, and it had done him good, although he was unaware of the cause of it. And here Ruth begs me to add that her very small share would have been of little use in this man's recovery had it not been for Edwin's long and unceasing work on his behalf. This was our first encounter with unfortunates of the lower spheres, and I have been somewhat protracted in giving details of it. It was, in many respects, straightforward by comparison with what we met later, and in recounting it I have done so because it was an introduction to our future work. For the present, however, it was not intended that we should do anything but make observations of the dark realms. The four of us resumed our journey. There were no paths to follow, and the ground was becoming decidedly rocky in formation. The light was rapidly diminishing from a sky that was heavy and black. There was not a soul, not a house, nor any sign of life to be seen. The whole district seemed colorless and empty, and we might have been wandering in another world. We could see dimly ahead of us, after the passage of some time, something which had the appearance of dwellings, and we moved in their direction. The terrain was now rocks and nothing else, and here and there we could see people seated with their heads down, seemingly almost lifeless, but in reality in the depths of gloom and despair. They took no notice of us whatever as we passed them, and soon we drew level with the dwellings we had viewed distantly. The dark realms. At close view it became clear that these dwellings were nothing more than mere hovels. They were distressing to gaze upon, but it was infinitely more distressing to contemplate that these were the fruits of men's lives upon earth. We did not enter any of the shacks. It was repulsive enough outside, and we could have served no useful purpose at present by going in. Edwin therefore gave us a few details instead. Some of the inhabitants, he said, had lived here or hereabouts year after year, as time is reckoned upon earth. They themselves had no sense of time, and their existence had been one interminable continuity of darkness through no one's fault but their own. Many had been the good souls who had penetrated into these Stygian realms to try to effect a rescue out of the darkness. Some had been successful, others had not. Success depends not so much upon the rescuer as upon the rescued. If the latter shows no glimmer of light in his mind, no desire to take a step forward on the spiritual road, then nothing, literally nothing, can be done. The urge must come from within the fallen soul himself. And how low some of them had fallen! Never must it be supposed that those who, in the earth's judgment, had failed spiritually are fallen low. Many such have not failed at all, but are, in point of fact, worthy souls, whose fine rewards awaits them here. But on the other hand, there are those whose earthly lives have been, spiritually, hideous, though outwardly sublime, whose religious professions, designated by a Roman collar, had been taken for granted as being synonymous with spirituality of soul. Such people have been mocking God throughout their sanctimonious lives on earth, where they lived with an empty show of holiness and goodness. Here they stand revealed for what they are. But the God they have mocked for so long does not punish. They punish themselves. The people living within these hovels that we were passing were not necessarily those who upon earth had committed some crime in the eyes of the earth people. There were many people who, without doing any harm, had never done any good to a single mortal upon earth. People who had lived entirely unto themselves, without a thought for others. Such souls constantly harped upon the theme that they had done no harm to anyone, but they had harmed themselves. As the higher spheres had created all the beauties of those realms, so had the denizens of these lower spheres built up the appalling conditions of their spirit life. There was no light in the lowest realms, no warmth, no vegetation, no beauty. But there is hope that every soul there will progress. It is in power of each soul to do so, and nothing stands in his way but himself. It may take him countless thousands of years to raise himself 1 inch spiritually, but it is an inch in the right direction. The thought inevitably came into my mind of the doctrine of eternal damnation, so beloved by Orthodox religion, and of the everlasting fires of so-called hell. If this place we were now could be called hell, and no doubt it would be by theologians, then there was certainly no evidence of fire or heat of any kind. On the contrary, there was nothing but a cold, dank atmosphere. Spirituality means warmth in the spirit world. Lack of spirituality means coldness. The whole fantastic doctrine of hellfire, a fire which burns but never consumes, is one of the most outrageously stupid and ignorant doctrines that has ever been invented by equally stupid and ignorant churchmen. Who actually invented it, no one knows, but it is still rigorously upheld as a doctrine by the church. Even the smallest acquaintance with spirit life instantly reveals the utter impossibility of it, because it is against the very laws of spirit existence. This concerns its literal side. What of the shocking blasphemy? What of the shocking blasphemy that it involves? When Edwin, Ruth, and I were on earth, we were asked to believe that God, the Father of the universe, actually punishes people by condemning them to burn in the flames of hell for all eternity. Could there ever be any grosser travesty of the God that orthodoxy professes to worship? The churches of whatever denomination have built up a monstrous conception of the eternal Father of heaven. They have made of him, on the one hand, a mountain of corruption by shallow lip service, by spending large sums of money to erect churches and chapels to his glory, by pretending a groveling contrition for having offended him, by professing to fear him who is all love. And on the other hand, we have the picture of a God who, without the slightest compunction, casts poor human souls into an eternity of the worst of all suffering, burning by fires that are unquenchable. We are taught glibly to beg for God's mercy. The church's God is a being of extraordinary moods. He must be continually placated. It is by no means certain that, having begged for mercy, we shall get it. He is much to be feared, because he can bring down his vengeance upon us at any moment. We do not know when he will strike. He is vengeful and unforgiving. He has commanded such trivialities as are embodied in church doctrines and dogmas, that at once expose not a great mind, but a small one. He has made the doorway to salvation so narrow that very few souls will ever be able to pass through it. He has built up on the earth plane a vast organization known as the Church, which shall be the sole depository of spiritual truth, an organization that knows practically nothing of the state of life in the world of spirit, yet dares to lay down the law to incarnate souls, and dares to say what is in the mind of the great Father of the universe, and dares to discredit his name by assigning to him attributes that he could not possibly possess. What do such silly, petty minds know of the great and almighty Father of love? Mark that, of love. Then think again of all the horrors I have enumerated, and think once more. Contemplate this. A heaven of all that is beautiful, of a heaven of more beauty than the mind of man incarnate can comprehend, a heaven of which one tiny fragment I have tried to describe to you, where all is peace and goodwill and love among fellow mortals. All these things are built up by the inhabitants of these realms and are upheld by the Father of heaven in his love for all mankind. What of the lower realms, the dark places we are now visiting? It is the very fact that we are visiting them that has led me to speak in this fashion, because standing in this darkness I am fully conscious of one great reality of eternal life, and that is that the high spheres of heaven are within the reach of every mortal soul that is, or is yet to be, born upon earth. The potentialities of progression are unlimited, and they are the right of every soul. God condemns no one. Man condemns himself, but he does not condemn himself eternally. It rests with himself as to when he shall move forward spiritually. Every spirit hates the lower realms for the unhappiness that is there and for no other reason. And for that reason great organizations exist to help every single soul who is living in them to rise out of them into the light. And that work will continue through countless ages until every soul is brought out from these hideous places. And at last all is as the Father of the universe intended it to be. This, I am afraid, has been a long digression. So let us return to our travels. You will recall my mention of the many heavenly perfumes and scents that came from the flowers and that float upon the air. Here in these dark places the very opposite was the case. Our nostrils were at first assailed by the most foul odors, odors that reminded us of the corruption of flesh in the earth world. They were nauseating, and I feared that it would prove more than Ruth and I myself could stand. But Edwin told us to treat them in the same way we had mastered the coldness of the temperature, by simply closing our minds to them, and that we should be quite unaware of their existence. We hastened to do so, and we were perfectly successful. It is not only sanctity that has its odor. In our travels through our realm, we can enjoy all the countless delights and beauties of it, together with the happy converse of its inhabitants. Here in these dark lands all is bleak and desolate. The very low degree of light itself cast a blight upon the whole region. Occasionally we were able to catch a glimpse of the faces of some unfortunates as we passed along. Some were unmistakably evil, showing the life of vice they had led upon the earth. Some revealed the miser, the avarice, the brute beast. There were people here from almost every walk of earthly life, from the present earthly times to far back in the centuries, and here was a connecting link with names that could be read in those truthful histories of nations in the library we visited in our own realm. Both Edwin and his friend told us that we should be appalled at the catalogue of names, well known in history, of people who were living deep down in these noxious regions, men who had perpetuated vile and wicked deeds in the name of holy religion or for the furtherance of their own despicable material ends. Many of these wretches were unapproachable, and they would remain so, perhaps for numberless more centuries, until, of their own wish and endeavor, they moved, however feebly, in the direction of the light of spiritual progression. We could see, as we walked along, with bands of seemingly demented souls passing on their way upon some prospective evil intent, if they could find their way to it. Their bodies presented the outward appearance of the most hideous and repulsive malformations and distortions, the absolute reflection of their evil minds. Many of them seemed old in years, but I was told that although such souls had been there perhaps for many centuries, it was not the passage of time that had so dealt with their faces, but their wicked minds. In the higher spheres, the beauty of mind rejuvenates the features, sweeps away the signs of earthly cares and troubles and sorrows, and presents to the eye that state of physical development which is that period of our earthly lives which we used to call the prime of life. The multitudinous sounds that we heard were in keeping with the awful surroundings, from mad, raucous laughter to the shriek of some soul in torment inflicted by others as bad as himself. Once or twice we were spoken to by some courageous souls who were down there upon their task of helping these afflicted mortals. They were glad to see us and to talk to us. In the darkness we could see them, and they could see us, but we were all of us invisible to the rest, since we were provided with the same protection for the dark lands. In our case, Edwin was taking care of us collectively as newcomers, but those whose work lies in rescue each had his own means of protection.